Switching leaves a mental residue. You finish one task, open the next, and your brain keeps part of the first one in play. You know the feeling. You click into a document, glance at your inbox, reach for your phone, and spend the next few minutes trying to remember what you were doing. That lag has a name in cognitive psychology: attentional residue. A study by Sophie Leroy described this effect after task switching. The important part is not that you are distracted. It is that your focus system stays partly attached to the previous task. What you call weak discipline is often a residue of the last task hanging on after the new one appears. The 20-minute leak people talk about is not a mood. It is the time your brain can spend rebuilding the task context it just dropped. By the end of this video, that lapse will stop looking like laziness. It will look like a specific brain state with a documented cause. The question is why the switch does not feel clean when the new task is right in front of you. The mechanism sits in your prefrontal cortex, the system that keeps goals active while you work. It helps you hold the rules of one task, suppress the rules of another, and update when the job changes. That is task set reconfiguration. The brain has to clear one set of priorities and load a new one. In daily life, the switch is not a single click. It is a sequence. You have to stop the old rules, select the new rules, and rebuild working memory around them. Researchers call this part of cognitive control, and it is effortful because the brain is always balancing speed and accuracy. The environment that shaped this system was full of one thing at a time. One conversation, one tool, one target. A browser tab, a Slack ping, and an email alert do not match that setup. In Leroy's work, people stayed mentally tied to the first task even after they had moved on. That leftover task context can slow reading, increase errors, and make the new task feel heavier than it should. The cost is real time, real mistakes, and a focus system that has to restart over and over. Once a task gets interrupted, the brain does not store only the content. It also stores the rules for how to act on that content. That is why switching from writing to email or from coding to a meeting can leave you reading the first sentence twice. The old task leaves behind a context signal. The new task arrives, but the prior one is still active enough to compete for attention. This is the part people misread as personal failure. It is often trained by the day itself. Every notification tells the brain that a new cue may matter more than the current line on the screen. Every quick check teaches the brain to expect interruption. Over time, the switch cost becomes familiar enough that people stop noticing it as a cost. They just feel scattered, slower, and more likely to miss a detail. The record is clear that the problem is not only distraction. It is the lingering mental setup from the previous task. Switching leaves a mental residue, and that residue can keep your focus divided long after the new task has begun. The next question is what keeps that old setup active, even when you think you have already moved on, and why some switches are harder than others. The harder switches are the ones that do not end cleanly. Rubinstein, Meyer, and Evans documented classic task switching costs in reaction time and errors, and the slowdown is not just a feeling. It shows up when the mind is still partly tuned to the old rules while the new task is already open. You look at the fresh tab, but your hand reaches for the old answer. That is the residue in action. But there is a detail almost everyone gets wrong here. The worst cost is often invisible. It does not announce itself as a collapse. It feels like a few normal seconds of hesitation, then a small reread, then another check. By the time you notice it, the day has already been cut into fragments. That is why switch cost is easy to dismiss and hard to escape. The bigger pattern is modern work. Digital tools turn a single stretch of effort into constant micro-switches. One message pings, one tab opens, one notification pulls. Each one asks the brain to rebuild the task frame again. That rebuild draws on limited control. The control system can shift, but it pays each time it has to hold a goal against interference. The brain did not evolve for a calendar full of self-made tasks, each one unfinished, abstract, and waiting in a separate window. It evolved in a world with fewer concurrent demands and clearer boundaries. So the cost compounds. Not because one switch ruins the day, but because the day becomes a chain of partial reloads. Every reload leaves a little more unfinished work in the background. Over a career, that means more starts, more restarts, more moments where the next task is present but not fully owned. Cal Newport calls this the cost of fragmented attention in everyday work, and the lived version is simpler. You sit down to begin, and your brain already expects interruption before you have written the first line. That expectation matters because repeated control strain becomes part of identity. People start saying they are lazy, scattered, or bad at focus. But the record points to a different story. When the environment keeps forcing residue, the brain learns the pattern of residue. It starts to feel like your normal state. So the open question is not whether you can try harder. It is what clears the old task out of the system so the next one can begin without carrying yesterday with it. The fix works because the circuit changes with repeated structure, not with moral effort. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to strengthen the patterns it uses most. If every task starts inside noise, the noise becomes the learned setup. If every task starts in a clean block, the brain learns that a block means one goal, not 5. That is why the environment comes first. Fewer interruptions reduce the number of times the control system has to rebuild a task set. Batching emails, messages, and admin into one window lowers switch frequency, so the brain is not paying the reconfiguration cost all day. A short reset between blocks also helps because it creates a clear boundary. Stand up, close the old tab, write the next goal on paper. Those cues tell the system that one frame is ending and another is starting. This is not about making work easier by pretending attention is unlimited. It is about reducing interference so the next goal can hold its place. The identity shift matters for the same reason. If you see yourself as someone who works in blocks, the environment is organized to match that role. If you see yourself as someone who is always available, every ping wins before the new task can settle. The mechanism is simple: fewer cues, fewer switches, less residue. More stable blocks, more stable control. That is the rewire. The brain is not being forced to become perfect. It is being given a shape that lets it stop starting over. So the practical order is clear. First, remove the cue that triggers the switch. Silence non-essential alerts. Put the phone out of reach. Keep only one active window for the block in front of you. Then build the block itself around a single task, not a pile of open loops. When the block ends, use a brief reset that marks closure. Save the file, clear the desk, write the next task on a note. That small boundary matters because the brain responds to context. It is easier to load one frame when the old one has been visibly closed. Next comes identity, not as a slogan, as a working rule. You are not the person who responds to every interruption. You are the person who protects a work block until it is done. That rule changes what you allow into the room, the screen, and the hour. It also changes the feeling of starting. The resistance at the beginning is no longer proof that something is wrong with you. It is residue from a system that has been overswitched. That is the payoff of the thesis phrase. Switching leaves a mental residue, but the residue is not a character flaw. It is a cost of task changes that the brain can be trained to carry less often. When the environment holds fewer interruptions and the identity holds fewer open doors, the next task starts cleaner. The new tab does not have to fight the old one for space. So the symptom from the start is resolved in plain terms. You are not broken when your mind lags after a switch. Your control system is doing exactly what the record says it does under fragmented demand. If this changed how you see it, the next one goes deeper. For now, the cleanest self-image is simple. I work best in blocks, and I let one task end before the next begins.